Thank you so much. I would like to extend my gratitude and appreciation for the invitation of CBRA for me to come here and talk about what Progenesis offers as far as data and solution for patients. And Progenesis is a genetic testing company based in California. We are not known in Brazil, but we have been providing genetic testing since 2015, being the first company to offer NGS in 2014 as part of our starting research. Today, since we're going to talk about technology, I have seen talks on mosaicism, so I'm going to be emphasizing mosaicism a little bit more in my presentation. So this is the scope of technology that we have seen in the last few years, obviously starting with FISH, going all the way to NGS. There are a few platforms in NGS. The two main ones are Thermo Fisher and Illumina. We have published our first papers in 2014 validating NGS for chromosome abnormality and sex chromosome abnormality. And so the distinction that we should make when we talk about technology is that there are two components. You have the chemistry and you have the sequencing platform. The sequencing platform, you have Illumina Thermo Fisher, you have some microarray solutions, Agilent and Illumina. And then the chemistry, either you have whole genome amplification or you have SNPs amplification. And, or we call them also targeted amplification. The trend now is going towards combining whole genome with SNPs so that you have whole chromosome picture, but you also have a very detailed information on SNP distribution. And the SNPs will help you solve some of the limitations, such as triploidies, especially the 69XXX, uniparental disomy, and it may give you an information about the paternity of the embryos. You know, sometimes when, being a reproductive endocrinologist, you have to transfer an embryo. You should be able to know if the embryo and the parents are related using a test such as a single tandem repeat test, which is the paternity test used on embryos. So the technology is moving, obviously, in a good direction. In 2018, we published our first paper on non-invasive prenatal tests. You can see from previous speakers, there are a number of publications on non-invasive testing. I want to give you guys my perspective on non-invasive PGT-A testing. Right now, when you look at the entire publication body, you have about 80% concordance between the media and the embryo. The reality is, when you look at gender, fortunately here in Brazil, gender is not reported in patient reports, but there is about 10% discrepancy. And there is a few limitations, including maternal contamination. And maternal contamination is when you have material coming from the oocytes, because when you do egg stripping, you still have remaining DNA in the media that stays there and that can contaminate the sample in a way that if you have an abnormality in the embryo, it may be masked by the contamination, and you may be transferring an aneuploid embryo that looks like a euploid on a PGT-A. And so, in my opinion, spent media is not yet ready for a prime clinical application. There is definitely a good potential of using a non-invasive testing, but it's still not yet there. And so we have another approach, which is the metabolic profiling. This metabolic profiling has been explored many years ago, but now it's coming back. It's coming back because, as any scientific approach, sometimes when you try to use a different technology and it's not used in the right context, we don't get a good clinical outcome, and then people get discouraged. and then they forget about it. But really, when you look at the metabolic profiling, it has a great potential. The reason is because you're looking at the embryo not just from a genomic perspective, you look at the metabolic activity. It's a completely different perspective. So if you put these two things together, you may improve the implantation and pregnancy rates. As of today, implantation rates in reproductive labs can be as high as 80%. The majority of labs of IVF centers in the US have about 70% implantation rates. The question is, what happens to those 30%? Why they are not implanting post-transfer? And the reality is because genomics does not give you the full picture, or at least in the context that we are using today. So what can you measure in an embryo from a metabolic perspective? You can look at how many or how much the metabolism of sugar is in the embryo is a sign of health in the embryo. You can look at secretion of certain hormones. We have seen in other studies, clinical studies, that the embryo does secrete hormones and does secrete interference that helps with the invasion of the endometrial environment. So there are things that happen in the embryo in the 5 days to 10 days that are critical to the implantation. If we can predict that ahead of time, obviously we're going to improve our outcome. Polygenic PGT-AP has been raised a little bit of interest in the community. There are still some limitations that I can see. One of them is the fact that the studies that were used to design those panels are based on European descendants, European population. It's hard to transfer that into other type of ethnic background, and also the genetic variability in the family is way smaller than the population. So if you design a panel based on 1 million of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and you go to a single family, the variability, genetic variability is very small, so it's hard to convert those algorithms into a single family embryo sibling. And there are other limitations, but I think it's something that is going to be probably used a little bit more extensively in the future. CRISPR technology, we have talked about that a few times in the last few years. It's definitely a breakthrough technology. Unfortunately, the way it was used in this example, using a receptor for HIV, wasn't the right context, maybe wasn't a high priority to solve certain problems in reproductive medicine. You know that, for example, mutations that cause mitochondrial diseases are hard to fix with pre-implantation genetic testing. So if we have done it on certain clinical cases that are more convincing, we could have had a different outcome as far as accepting CRISPR in embryos. And they have not involved the scientific community and ethical community, and that's definitely something that we have missed in this. I think CRISPR is going to come back eventually to solve certain problems. So artificial intelligence is definitely very important in this puzzle of solving infertility. And it can be used in multiple forms. Right now it is used to address the noise that we see in PGT-A plots. So there are certain algorithms that will predict certain profile, PGT-A profile, and they will predict which one is noise versus which one is real. I think when you apply that to PGT profile, it's still a very weak indicator because the profiles of PGT are very unpredictable, and sometimes noise is unpredictable. But if you use it in the context of looking at an embryo from a developmental aspects, you look at time lapse, and you can extract some of that valuable information, then you combine that with a PGT-A result, you're going to definitely increase the likelihood of implantation and pregnancy. So if you look at a time-lapse AI solution is about 80% predictive value. PGT-A is much higher, but you can definitely, if you combine those synergistically, you can improve outcome. Big data, in my opinion, is a must-have in any laboratory. And the reason is because when you look at patients and they're 100 patients or a small population, you don't see a lot of things. But you have big data, you start pulling the right information. We have a database right now with 135,000 embryos, looking at all kind of correlations, comparing day 5 to day 6, comparing stimulation protocols, comparing embryologists to see why certain clinics don't perform as much as the high-performing clinics. And we're using this data to help certain clinics improve the outcome. So we have about 145 embryologists and about 300 physicians in that portal. This is how the portal looks like. So you can look at euploidy rates, aneuploidy frequency. Aneuploidy frequency is so important because, you know, when you look at PGTA, we know chromosome 13, 15, 21, 22 are the most commonly found chromosomes. And you look at miscarriages, there is the same distribution. So if you are seeing chromosome 1, 2, or 3 being very common in your population of patients, that is noise. And so data is definitely a very important aspect when you try to understand your outcome. And here we have clinical outcome, we have the transfer rate, which is the likelihood of having at least one euploid embryo in a patient given the age of the patient and the number of blasts. Going to how do we improve outcome? Outcome has 3 components. You obviously has patients, which is you look at the history of the patient, the endometriosis, whether it's a PCOS, and all the context that comes with it, and then you look at the physician simulation protocol, the timing of the retrieval, the timing of the transfer, and the labs. You have all the quality control, quality assurance of the PGTA, and the IVF lab, and all that data, how it is used to actually come up with a good improvement. Mosaicism, I'm not going to talk about this introduction because it has been done. Mosaicism is common in nature, as we know. It is very uncommon given when we look at biopsies, for example, when we look at biopsies that are mosaic and we retest them, we have about 0.5% mosaicism rates. Our mosaicism is 2%, but when we retest the embryos, it's only 0.5% that are confirmed mosaic embryos. So we think mosaic obviously is real, but is not that common. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to explain why I think mosaicism is inflated, but I'm going to just give you a couple of examples. If you look at mosaicism rate just by looking at the technology platform, Illumina versus Thermo Fisher, with the Illumina platform, regarding of the laboratory, the Illumina platform will give you a mosaicism rate between 6 to 25%. Thermo Fisher will give you about 6% on average. If you really dive deep into defining mosaicism and removing the noise and improving the quality of the test, you can go as low as 2%, 2.5%. And when you retest those mosaic, is 0.5%. Here, I'm showing you 145 embryologists looking at mosaicism rates, just comparing embryologists. The difference is tremendous. Some embryologists have 0.5%, some of them have 10%. And that gives you an idea that a biopsy technique, the culturing system, the amount of biopsy that you take are very trivial when it comes to determining the right mosaicism rates. This is just a miscarriage study confirming a mosaic rate of about 3.5%. Mosaicism is not dependent on age. That is one observation that points out that mosaicism is noise, because if it was real and if it's a result of aging, it will increase over time with age. We have seen data from DASA earlier, is not related with age. Here also, we don't see any correlation with age. This is the distribution of aneuploidy in our PGTA. This, you can see chromosome 16, 18, 21, 13, 15, 16, 18, 21. And when you look at mosaic embryos, that distribution disappears because the data has a lot of noise. And I think with this, I'm going to wrap up. I have already talked about confirming mosaicism being 0.25%. And with that, I am going to wrap up this conversation because it's already 0 minutes. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, we'll be here. Thank you. Appreciate it.